Peace. I call the Honourable Member for Pearce, the question being the House to now adjourn.
Madam Speaker, thank you. The National Security Legislation Amendment Bill and the Counter-Terrorism Legislation Amendment Foreign Fighters Bill, and soon the Telecommunications Interception and Access Amendment Data Retention Bill, represent collectively the most significant reforms to the legislative regime governing Australia's national security for many years. I rise, Madam Speaker, first to support the Attorney-General for his stewardship of this suite of legislation which is critical to our national security and which has been drafted in a way which is reasonably and proportionately adapted to its important purpose. But second, I wanted to make some comment on 2 points of criticism that have emerged regarding the package of bills that have been debated so far. This is worthwhile doing because it illustrates how sometimes when issues of civil liberties are raised in the context of what are often technical criminal law and security legislation, there is a tendency to give undue weight to arguments which are just plainly wrong. There are 2 examples of very weak arguments that moved almost seamlessly from being espoused by fringe adherents of completely unfettered civil liberties to the mainstream media. First, the National Security Bill constructed new and unreasonable restrictions on press freedom, and second, the criticism that the Foreign Fighters Bill and its overseas travel exclusion somehow reverse the onus of proof in a manner that is radical or unacceptable. Of course, there's no such thing even close to resembling unfettered freedom of speech or travel or of the press, and there is always a balancing exercise to determine where to appropriately draw the line between public safety and the limits of a variety of types of personal liberty. But a key rhetorical device that is used repetitiously in arguing against just about any security measure is that what is being proposed is unheralded or new or radical. And if true, that argument carries some weight, but the problem is that it is rarely correct. And I suspect that this claim will be incorrectly made with respect to the upcoming data holding provisions, but in anticipation of that, it's worthwhile looking at how true the claim was with respect to previous civil liberties arguments. It has been argued that Section 35 of the National Security Bill represented some kind of unheralded restriction on press ability to report on law enforcement operations. Leaving aside the fact that Section 35 applies to all persons and that it's not exclusively or even primarily aimed at journalists, and leaving aside the fact that security intelligence operations are rare and only are conducted in the most serious of circumstances, and leaving aside the fact that the amendments do not allow for the suppression of information relating to unlawful conduct, which information can be delivered by any person to the Independent Inspector General of Intelligence Services for investigation and, where appropriate, public supporting, and leaving aside the fact that the provision is designed for a clear and reasonable purpose of protecting the life and safety of ASIO officers, leaving all that aside, it's simply incorrect to suggest that there is something new in the provisions. And this is so because it is a principle and a mechanical provision and legislative structure that already applies to protect AFP officers engaged in commensurate operations. There is simply nothing new or radical or novel in the provisions that have been passed through this House. The second area where there has been a very weak criticism of the Coalition's national security package has received airtime, which has been hugely disproportionate to its merit, and that was in relation to the creation of the offence of entering or remaining in a declared area. Leaving aside that the section provides for a number of logical exceptions, we've had arguments such as that from Senator Wright in the other place that, and I quote, the offence does not include a fault element, it does not include a mental intention element, it does not require the person to be travelling with any kind of criminal or wrongful intent. A number of opponents of the legislation have suggested that this provision and its operation, or because it reverses, should be opposed because of its operation or because it reverses the onus of proof and is therefore radical and therefore wrong, the wrong place to draw the line. Clause 119.2 makes it clear that the defendant bears an evidential burden under Section 13.3, not a legal burden of proof under Section 13.4. Quite simply, what this means is that a defendant who wishes to suggest that they have a lawful reason for being in the area must point to or adduce evidence to show that there is a reasonable possibility that he or she had a lawful excuse to be there, noting that the prosecution case may have already provided such evidence. Once the possibility is evident, it must be negated by the prosecution beyond reasonable doubt. Such a concept is simply not a reversal of the onus of proof, and it's certainly not a process which is novel to the law. Indeed, nothing under this exclusion provision is a novelty. Breaching geographic exclusions is far from novel, nor is the absence of a criminal mental element. Indeed, ever since the Criminal Code Act was introduced in 1995, Clause 6.1 has operated to create strict liability offences where no fault element has been required to be demonstrated. State governments have been utilising geographic exclusionary orders in one form or another for many years, such as protecting the peace and order of nominated domestically geographical areas. It is common in domestic violence orders. It is common in move-on notices. None of these are particularly new principles, and neither are those which have been passed through this House.
The question is, if this House to now adjourn, I call the honourable member for Indi.